Richard Chase pled guilty to killing 6 people, who drank the victims' blood and cannibalized their remains. Now, this begs the question, how does somebody end up like this? Along with focusing on his crimes, we're going to explore the psychology behind his formative years and examine the age-old question, was he born a killer, or was he made into one? Welcome to Mind of a Killer. I'm your host, Anneliese Chase, and in today's episode, we're diving into the early life of Richard Trenton Chase, who headlines have dubbed the Vampire Sacramento, who remains one of the most disturbing figures in American criminal history. This is episode 3 in this 3-part series. If you haven't listened to the last 2 episodes, we talked about Charles Cullen, the Angel of Death, and Aileen Wuornos, the Highway Killer. In this episode, you will definitely hear similarities between all 3 cases here today. As we continue, we will dive into, the mind of a killer. We will go over the crimes and the psychology behind these killers. Richard Chase was born on May 23, 1950, in Santa Clara County, California. From an early age, there were warning signs that he was not developing normally. He grew up in a household marked by instability and alleged physical abuse. His father reportedly was a strict disciplinary, frequently used harsh punishment, and was emotionally unavailable. His mother, while present, was described as anxious and withdrawn. This toxic environment left the young Richard emotionally isolated and confused. Lean Morrison, a forensic psychologist, said this about Richard's family.
That there was a lot of arguing, there was some physical abuse, but not to the extent that it was out of the norm of the culture at that time. As children at that time were very frequently beaten, and it was just considered that's how you discipline your child.
Even as a small child, Richard exhibited deep, troubling behaviors. According to reports, he was prone to violent outbursts and irrational fears. One of the most earliest red flags was cruelty to animals. He would kill cats and dogs in disturbing ways. These acts were not just signs of aggression, they were ritualistic and hinted at developing obsession with blood and death. This is the number one sign of mental distress that turns violent in murderers. Academically, Richard was an average student, but socially, he was awkward and withdrawn. He often struggled to make friends and came across as eccentric and emotionally distant. Teachers and classmates noted that he lacked empathy and often displayed inappropriate behavior, yet he was never seriously evaluated for any mental illness by professionals during this time. I won't do this every time, but this is very similar to how Charles Cullen and Aileen Wuornos were brought up, with no parental love or guidance very early on, not having the support of friends or family. This is a big puzzle piece for their downfall, but it does not mean that everyone who has a traumatic past will end up as killers. As he entered puberty, Richard's emotional state deteriorated. He began to experience body-related anxieties and hypochondriac delusions, such as believing his heart would stop or that somebody had removed part of his skull. These signs of emerging psychosis were compounded by the absence of intervention or support. Instead of receiving mental health care, Richard was left to navigate adolescence under the pressure of untreated mental illnesses and turbulent home life. Richard's delusions intensified in his early 20s. He started abusing drugs and alcohol, which likely exacerbated his condition. He also began to show symptoms consisting of paranoid schizophrenia, though his official diagnosis varied depending on the evaluation per professional. He was hospitalized several times for his mental health issues. In one particular notable instance, he was admitted into a psychiatric facility after injecting himself with rabbit's blood, believing that it would prevent his heart from shrinking. During this time, he earned the nickname Dracula among the hospital staff due to his fixation on blood. This is what hospital staff said about Chase.
Doing things with small animals and birds, killing them, drinking their blood.
He needed extensive care. He was not receiving as much care as he should have gotten.
Despite the severity of his delusions, Richard was eventually deemed no longer a threat and was released from the institution. He was placed under the care of his mother, who, despite his alarming condition, weaned him off his psychotic medication. This would be proved as a tragic mistake. After going back into the care of his mother, Richard's delusions and blood obsession continued. This is what defense attorney Ferris Samley had to say about Richard when he was in the care of his mother.
One time the mother came in and saw him ripping a pit apart and rubbing the blood on his face, that type of thing. And she didn't report it.
After living with his mother, Richard lived in his own apartment in Sacramento. His behavior deteriorated rapidly. Neighbors reported him walking around naked, killing and dissecting small animals, and even eating raw meat. He believed that his blood was turning into powder and that drinking blood of others could save him. He also developed an obsession with the idea that Nazis and UFOs were conspiring against him. As his delusions grew darker, Richard began to act on them in horrifying ways. He started breaking into homes, not to steal, but to search for unlocked doors, as he believed that if a door was unlocked, he was meant to enter it. He would often drink the blood of pets that he found inside these homes. Richard's killing sprees spanned less than a month, but it left a deep and lasting scar on the community. His first murder occurred December 29, 1977, when he fatally shot Ambrose Griffin, a 51-year-old engineer and father of two. It seemed as a random act of a drive-by shooting at his home. They assumed it was the thrill of some random killing from some kids. This killing marked the beginning of a chilling pattern. On January 23, 1978, Richard committed a brutal home invasion, killing Teresa Wallen, a pregnant woman who was home alone. He entered through her unlocked front door, shot her 3 times, and engaged in horrifying post-mortem mutilation. He drank her blood and removed some of her organs, taking them with him. This murder stunned law enforcement, who were unprepared for the grotesque nature of the crime scene. Just 4 days later, on January 27, 1978, Richard escalated his violence. He broke into a home of Evelyn Morth, who was 38, where she was babysitting her 22-month-old nephew, David, while also watching her 6-year-old son, Jason, and a friend named Dan Meredith. He murdered all 4. Dan was shot in the hallway, Evelyn and Jason were killed in the bedroom, and the baby was abducted. The brutality of this crime shocked even seasoned investigators. Evelyn's body had been mutilated and Richard had engaged in necrophilic acts and cannibalism. He used a yogurt cup to drink her blood. The baby's body was later found near a church, decapitated. This final act of violence led to a massive manhunt. Police were able to identify Richard through a tip from an old classmate and evidence that he curiously left behind, including fingerprints and a footprint at the scene. On January 28, 1978, authorities arrested him at his apartment. Inside, they found overwhelming evidence of his crimes: blood-stained clothes, human body parts in the refrigerator, and a calendar with the words "Today" marked on several future dates, possibly signaling for more planned murders. His trial began in 1979, and through his defense, he tried to argue insanity. the jury ultimately found him legally sane. He was convicted on 6 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death in the gas chamber. However, Richard never made it to execution. On December 26, 1980, he was found dead in his cell at San Quentin State Prison. He had an overdose on combination of prescribed antidepressants, which he had saved up for weeks, effectively committing suicide. Richard Chase's case became a focal point for discussion around mental illness, criminal responsibility, and the failure of the psychiatric and criminal justice systems. Experts concluded that he suffered from paranoia schizophrenia, exacerbated from his substance abuse, social isolation, and the lack of effective treatment. He exhibited serious symptoms of psychosis, including insomniac delusions, beliefs that something was wrong with his body, hallucinations, and disoriented thinking. One of the most disturbing and central features of his delusions were the obsession with his blood. This fixation was not symbolic or sadistic, it was, in his mind, a matter of life or death. Richard believed that his own blood was deteriorating, that his body was dehydrating from the inside out, and that his heart was shrinking. These delusions were part of what we know as a synaptic type delusion disorder, where the person believes that there's something gravely wrong with their bodily functions despite no medical evidence. In Richard's case, he thought his blood was turning into powder, that he was dying of internal decay. He also claimed that his stomach was backwards and his bones were moving inside to his skull. To fix this, he began to consume raw animal organs and blood, hoping that they would replenish his failing system. This is what defense attorney Ferris Samley had to say about Richard's condition.
He thought he was being poisoned. He thought he had bones growing out of the back of his head. He thought his stomach was upside down, his pulmonary artery had been stolen, and he was in great physical pain. It was all imagined, of course.
This behavior evolved into a full-blown belief system that blood was essential for his survival, almost if he was a vampire. Psychologists have associated with this and now sometimes referred as the Renfield syndrome, named after a character in Bram Stoker's Dracula, where individuals become obsessed with ingesting blood due to their beliefs it has restorative properties. However, it is important to note that this is not an official recognized disorder in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, but rather a term used to anecdotally to describe a rare, blood obsessive behavior. Richard's perception of the world had become so warped that he was no longer viewed blood as something sacred or symbolic. It became, to him, a literal life source. His compulsive needs for blood was not vampirism or a pop culture sense. It was the manifestation of a deep, broken mind trying to survive through any means necessary. Tragically, his victims were not selected out of hatred or intent, but they were seen as vessels for what he thought he needed. Despite these delusions, the court ultimately found him legally sane, a decision that stirred controversy in both legal and psychological circles. While he was clearly psychotic, the narrow definition of legal sanity, not understanding the nature or wrongness of one's actions, did not apply in the eyes of the law. Richard tried to conceal some of his crimes, and this was seen as evidence of knowing from right and wrong, even if his motives were delusions. The case of Richard Chase has been the subject of numerous books, documentaries, podcasts, and TV dramatizations. His story is often cited as an example of what can happen when severe mental illness goes untreated. It also serves a reminder of the complex relationship between mental health and criminal responsibility. One of the most chilling aspects of Richard's case is how preventable it may have been. He had been hospitalized, diagnosed, and shown unmistakable signs of danger, yet systematic failures allowed him to slip through the cracks. Richard is often lumped in with one of the most infamous serial killers in U.S. history, but his crimes were not driven by sadism or manipulation, as seen as in the cases of Ted Bundy or Jeffrey Dahmer. Rather, they were driven by pure psychosis, a mind utterly detaching from reality. Richard Trenton Chase was not only a killer but a profound disturbed man who became a tragic symbol of untreated mental illness and a system failure. His brief but terrifying reign of violence left a mark on American criminal history and continues to serve as a dark case study in both forensic psychology and criminal justice. His story is not only about murder, but about the consequences of neglecting mental health, the fine line between sanity and criminal responsibility, and the horror that can unfold when delusion becomes deadly. Richard Trenton Chase, infamously dubbed the Vampire Sacramento, still remains one of the most disturbing figures in American criminal history. His series of murders in 1977 and 1978 shocked the nation, not only because of their brutality, but also due to the deranged logic that fueled them. Richard drank blood of his victims, mutilated their bodies, and believing that doing so was the only way to save his life. As with many serial killers, Richard's descent into madness raised an essential and enduring question in psychology and criminology. Was Richard born a killer, or did his environment shape him into one? The nature versus nurture debate is a complex, and in the case of Richard Chase, is particularly compelling. His life reveals a tragic interplay between biological vulnerability and environmental failure, making his story an extreme yet intriguing case study about how unaddressed mental illness, traumatic experience, and societal neglect can combine into producing a monstrous outcome. The argument from the nature side of the debate emphasizes Richard's biological predispositions towards mental illness. There is a strong evidence that Richard was suffering from paranoid schizophrenia, a severe and chronic mental disorder that profoundly affects how a person thinks, feels, and behaves. Schizophrenia has a well-documented genetic component, with studies indicating that individuals with a first-degree relative, such as a parent or sibling, with the disorder have a higher likely risk of developing it themselves. While there is no public record confirming that Richard had family members with schizophrenia, the hallmarks of the disorder, including auditory hallucinations, delusions of perception, and bodily dysfunction, emotional flatness, and erotic behavior, were clearly present in his behavior. From a young age, he experienced somniac delusions, believing that his heart was shrinking, his blood was turning into powder, and that his stomach was backwards. These delusions eventually evolved into the belief that only consuming blood could prevent him from dying. in addition to schizophrenia, many serial killers, particularly those who kill in ritualistic or sadistic ways, show signs of neurological dysfunction or structured brain immoralities, especially in the frontal lobes, which governs impulse control and judgment. There is no direct evidence that Richard underwent neurological testing to confirm any brain damage, but his erratic, disoriented behavior and an inability to conform to social norms suggest cognitive impairment. It is also important to consider the role of neurological chemical imbalances. Richard had a history of substance abuse, which included heavy use of LSD, marijuana, and alcohol, especially during his formative years. These substances, especially in genetically vulnerable individuals, can trigger or worsen the onset of schizophrenia, particularly in males in their late teens or early 20s. Taken together, the biological evidence suggests that Richard may have been genetically and neurologically predisposed to severe mental illness, which played a major role in his disoriented perception of reality and the lack of empathy. However, genetics alone cannot fully explain this descent. Many people with schizophrenia or antisocial traits never commit violent acts. That's where nurture, the influence of life experience, and environment come into sharper focus. Richard's upbringing paints a bleak portrait of a boy lost in an abusive, chaotic environment. He was born in 1950 in Santa Clara County, California, to what all accounts was a deeply dysfunctional household. His parents were reportedly strict, emotionally unavailable, and possibly physically abusive. His father was a domineering and often resorting to a severe punishment. From a young age, Richard displayed emotional instability. He was withdrawn, socially awkward, and unable to form meaningful connection with peers. Teachers noticed that he had trouble concentrating and often seemed off. Rather than receiving help, however, Richard was ignored or punished for this behavior, further deepening his alienation. No intervention was made to address his early signs of psychological dysfunction, and mental health services in the 1950s and 60s were woefully inadequate or stigmatized. As Richard entered adolescence, he became extremely isolated and developed early delusion thinking. When he started to become obsessed with his bodily functions and often complaining about imaginary ailments, instead of support or evaluation, Richard was mocked or dismissed for these complaints, enforcing his mistrust of others. Here, the nurture argument is deeply compelling. Had Richard received constant and compassionate and informed mental health care, his delusions may have been manageable. Instead, he was misunderstood, mistreated, and neglected, left to spiral until he turned violent. His story serves as a grim example of the consequences of social and institutional fear. Perhaps the most insightful way to understand Richard Chase is to not choose between nature and nurture, but to recognize how the two forces amplified one another. Richard was likely born with a biological vulnerability to mental illness, perhaps schizophrenia or another neurological development disorder, but that predisposition, left untreated, compounded by abuse, isolation, drug use, and societal neglect, pushed him past the point of no return. This intersection is known as the diathesis stress model in psychology. The model posits that individuals inherit certain vulnerabilities, the diathesis, that remains latent until triggered by environmental stressors. In Richard's case, the combination of a toxic family life, early trauma, and social analyzation, drug use, and the lack of psychological care serves as the stressors that activated his genetic predisposition towards psychosis. Even his obsession with blood, the most disturbing aspect of his crimes, can be understood through this lens. Richard did not kill out of sadistic pleasure, as some serial killers do. He genuinely believed that he needed blood to survive, a belief rooted in his somatic delusions, intensified by his years of isolation and unchallenged psychosis. One of the most haunting questions raised by Richard's story is, could have it been prevented? Many experts believe that it could have, or at least that intervention may have spared lives. Richard's psychotic break was not sudden. It unfolded over years, and it was visible to those around him. Neighbors, family, and medical staff saw the signs, yet failed to act meaningfully or consistently. His release from psychiatric care, the lack of follow-up, and the removal from medication from his mother were all pivotal failures in the system. This is not to excuse Richard's actions, but to point out that society has a role to play in supporting individuals with severe mental illness. Treating mental health as a public issue, rather than a moral or criminal failing, could help prevent tragedies like this from occurring in the future. The case of Richard Trenton Chase forces us to confront the darkest possibilities of the human mind and the devastating consequences when both nature and nurture go wrong. He was not born evil in the traditional sense. Rather, he was born vulnerable, and that vulnerability was ignored, misunderstood, and ultimately weaponized by years of abuse, neglect, and isolation. His life and crimes remind us that the nature versus nurture debate is not an either-or proposition. Instead, it is an intricate, tragic interplay. In Richard, biologically planted the seed, but the environment allowed it to grow unchecked into something monstrous. To prevent such horrors from repeating, society must commit to early health intervention, compassionate care, and diligent support for those who are at risk. In understanding Richard Chase, we don't just glimpse at the making of killers. We see the consequences of a world that has turned somebody on its back, in desperate need of help. Could proper treatment and intervention could have prevented him from becoming a serial killer? How can we, as a society, identify and support individuals who are struggling before it's too late? These are crucial questions to consider as we work to improve our understanding of criminal psychology and the systems that allow such individuals to slip through the cracks. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you believe that Richard Chase was destined for darkness, or could early intervention change his path? Thank you so much for tuning in to this 3-part series. This was part 3 of my senior capstone project at Assumption University.